I am Clara, 30 years old, and for as long as I can remember, our old house in Maplewood, Vermont, was more than a place to live. It was the story of my life. Every hallway echoing with memories I thought would be mine forever. I had cared for that place like it was a fragile treasure, patching every crack, painting every wall, keeping it alive through years when it could have crumbled. I believed it would always remain my one true refuge, the home that would never betray me. But all it took was one night at dinner for everything I thought I knew about family to collapse. My mother's fork slammed against the wooden table so hard it felt like the air itself split apart. Her voice cut sharp through the silence. "You have 2 days to pack your things and leave. This house belongs to your sister now." My father kept his gaze on his plate, silent, as if his agreement was carved into stone. My sister, who had been living miles away in California without lifting a finger for this home, suddenly had everything handed to her. I sat frozen, staring at the walls I had worked so hard to protect, the floors I had repaired with my own hands, the furniture I had bought with years of savings, all of it erased by a sentence that burned like a scar. They rewarded the one who gave nothing, while discarding me as if I had never mattered. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. There was no use in arguing. Their decision had been made, and my protests would only echo back at me. Without a word, I rose from the table and walked to my room. My hands trembled as I gripped my phone, but my mind had already begun forming a plan. They thought I would walk away quietly. They thought I would accept defeat and disappear. They were wrong. When my sister stepped into this house after those 2 days, she would discover that she had inherited more than she bargained for. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the Maplewood kitchen, but its warmth couldn't wash away the sting of my mother's ultimatum. I moved through the house slowly, running my hand across the walls I had painted, the furniture I had bought, the rooms I had revived after years of neglect. This wasn't just a building. It was proof of every sacrifice I had made for my family. I remembered 5 years earlier when their finances collapsed. Bills piled high, debt collectors called, and my parents whispered of losing everything. I had stepped in without hesitation. My career in software engineering had been kind to me, and I drained $80,000 from my savings to cover the mortgage, working overtime just to keep them afloat. I had believed I was saving all of us, not just the bricks and beams of a house. I remembered the night the bank called, threatening foreclosure. My father sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, papers scattered like broken glass. My mother's voice trembled with despair as she said we were about to lose everything. I couldn't let it happen. I had walked into that bank, signed the checks, and saved the house. The relief on their faces made me believe it was worth it. I thought I was cementing my place, securing our family's legacy. But now, years later, those same parents looked at me like I was a stranger in the home I had rescued. My sister, meanwhile, remained a ghost. Living far away, she barely called twice a year. When I mentioned the sacrifices I was making, she laughed and said that was my problem. She never sent a dime, never lifted a hand, never cared to ask about the repairs I stayed up late to finish. Yet my parents spoke of her with glowing pride. Her marketing career, her glamorous life in California, her successes that were paraded in every conversation. I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was normal. Parents are supposed to be proud of their children. But now I saw it clearly. Their pride in her was never matched by pride in me. Their silence about my sacrifices was louder than any praise could have been. I stood in the living room, staring at the sofa I had bought with my first big paycheck, remembering the joy I had felt carrying it through the door. To me, that sofa was more than furniture. It was proof of the life I was building, piece by piece, inside this home. Now, I realized, if they wanted me gone, I would not leave behind what was mine. Every item I had paid for, every dollar I had poured into this house, I would claim. If my sister thought she could walk into a furnished home, she was about to be disappointed. This was not over. Not by a long shot. By afternoon, my resolve hardened into action. I knew I couldn't fight this battle with emotion alone. I needed facts, proof, and someone who understood how to wield them. So, I dialed the number of the one person I trusted more than anyone else when life became unbearable. Her name was Rachel, my closest friend since our college days at the University of Vermont. She had a razor-sharp mind and a heart that never wavered, and now she was a lawyer who thrived on unraveling complicated messes. When she answered, her calm voice steadied me, grounding me in the middle of the storm. I told her everything. I spoke about my mother's forks slamming down, the ultimatum of 2 days, the betrayal of my father's silence, and the cruel unfairness of watching my sister inherit what I had poured my entire being into. Rachel listened quietly, never interrupting, but I could hear her pen scratching across paper, her focus absolute. When I finally finished, she asked one question in her firm, deliberate tone. Do you have any legal documents about the house? Anything left behind by your parents or before them? The question jolted me. I remembered my grandfather, the man who had built this house with his own hands decades earlier. He had passed away only 2 years ago, but I had always believed the house went directly to my parents after his death. At least, that was the story I had been told. Rachel's silence stretched for a moment. Then she said, "Give me an hour. Don't do anything until I call you back." I nodded, though she couldn't see me, clutching the phone as though it were a lifeline. That hour dragged like a lifetime. I paced the creaking hallway, touching the photographs that lined the walls, pausing at the one of me and my grandfather beneath the tall oak tree in the front yard. His arm had been wrapped around my shoulders, his smile crinkling his weathered face. I could still hear his gravelly voice promising, "Clara, this house will always be yours." I had brushed it off as affection at the time, never thinking it might have been something more. Now his words echoed in my chest like a warning I had ignored. When Rachel finally called back, her voice carried an urgency that made my heart pound. "Clara, you're not going to believe this," she said. She had tracked down my grandfather's will at the county clerk's office. My parents had never mentioned it, not once. Rachel read aloud, her tone steady and sharp. My grandfather had left the house to me, not to my parents, not to my sister, to me alone. His signature and a notary's mark sealed the document 3 years before he died. My knees buckled, and I sank onto the edge of my bed, trembling. How could I not have known? My voice cracked into the silence. Rachel's reply was colder, sharper. Your parents knew. They chose to hide it from you. The truth slammed into me harder than any argument. My parents had watched me pour $80,000 into saving this home, watched me repair every floorboard and paint every wall, while knowing all along that the house was mine by right. They had let me struggle, had taken my sacrifices without a word, and now they were trying to hand it to someone who hadn't even been here in years. My heart twisted with grief, but grief hardened into fury. This wasn't just unfair, this was betrayal. A calculated decision to erase me from the story of the very place my grandfather had entrusted to me. I walked to the kitchen, every step heavy with clarity. My grandfather's old mug sat chipped on the counter, the one I had held as a child while listening to his stories. I gripped it tightly, remembering his voice, his belief in me. My parents had tried to silence that memory, to rewrite his final wish. But I wouldn't let them. They had crossed a line, and I was done playing the role of the obedient daughter who always sacrificed without question. Rachel's words echoed through my thoughts. The will is ironclad. You have every legal right to this house. We can challenge them, and we will. For the first time in days, I felt the fog lift. My path was clear. I gathered every receipt, every bank statement, every scrap of evidence of the money I had poured into this home. I started a list of everything I had bought: the sofa, the curtains, the washer, the television, marking down the sacrifices I had made. My notebook filled quickly with numbers and details, each line a piece of armor I could wield in the fight ahead. I wasn't walking away quietly. My parents thought they had blindsided me, but they had underestimated me. This was only the beginning, and by the time it was over, they would realize exactly what they had thrown away. The morning after Rachel confirmed the truth about the will, I woke before dawn. The house was unnervingly quiet. My parents away visiting friends in Montpelier, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, broken only by the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet as I walked into the living room. I looked around, my eyes falling on the gray sofa I had saved for months to buy, the flat-screen television mounted on the wall, the curtains that matched the warm beige paint I had rolled across the walls one long weekend. Every single item represented a piece of my life, proof of my sacrifices, my determination to make this place not just livable, but beautiful. And now, my parents expected me to leave it all behind for my sister to enjoy as if she had earned it. That was never going to happen. I sat at the table with my notebook, methodically listing every piece of furniture, every appliance, every repair I had personally paid for. The washer in the basement, the chairs I had replaced after my mother complained about the old ones. Even the small details: the curtains, the rug in the living room, the lamp I had bought late one night online were mine. If they wanted to force me out, fine. But I wasn't leaving my life behind for someone else to claim. My sister would not step into a home already furnished, comfortable, and alive with my touch. If she wanted a house, she could furnish it herself. With my list in hand, I made a call to a moving company I had found online. Green Mountain Movers, a small local business with good reviews. A man named Tom answered. His voice was casual, almost distracted, until I explained what I needed. A rush job, today, no delays. I could almost hear his hesitation over the line, but eventually, he agreed. By noon, a truck would be at the house. Relief coursed through me. This was my first act of reclaiming what was mine. It wasn't about running away. It was about refusing to give my sister the satisfaction of walking into something she didn't deserve. As I waited for the movers, I walked through the house with sticky notes, marking what stayed and what went. The kitchen table, handed down from my grandfather, would remain. But the chairs I had bought with my own money? They were mine. I placed a note on each one. I moved from room to room, tagging, cataloging, reclaiming. The act was strangely soothing, as though each item I marked was a declaration of my independence, a refusal to be erased. Around mid-morning, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Mrs. Bennett, our neighbor from across the street, standing there with a worried expression. She was in her 60s, a kind woman who always brought us cookies at Christmas. She had seen me pacing through the windows and came to check in. "Are you all right, Clara?" she asked gently. I forced a small smile, the words caught in my throat. It's complicated, I admitted, brushing at my eyes before the tears could fall. She touched my arm softly. You've always been good to this house. Whatever's happening, you don't deserve this. Her kindness nearly broke me, but it also gave me strength. She saw me. She had always seen me, even when my own parents didn't. Not long after, another neighbor stopped by, Mr. Hale, still in his work boots, dust clinging to his shirt. He had known my grandfather well and often reminisced about fishing trips they used to take together. He glanced around the living room, his brow furrowing. This place meant a lot to him, you know, he said quietly. And to you too, doesn't it? My throat tightened, and I could only nod. His words anchored me in that moment. A reminder that I wasn't alone in remembering the value of what had been entrusted to me. My parents might have chosen to forget my grandfather's wishes, but our neighbors hadn't. They knew. They understood. By noon, the moving truck pulled up, a white van with 3 men climbing out, ready for the job. I led them through the house, pointing out the tagged items. They worked quickly, carrying out the sofa, wrapping the washer in blankets to prevent scratches, hauling the television from the wall. I stood back, watching as my belongings were lifted one by one into the truck. It was surreal, as though I was dismantling the life I had built piece by piece. Yet with every item carried out, I felt lighter, stronger. This wasn't an ending. It was me taking control of what was mine. Rachel called while the movers worked, her voice brisk and confident. She had already prepared the paperwork to enforce my grandfather's will. All we needed now was documentation of my contributions, and I had plenty. Every receipt, every bank statement, every purchase was ready to prove that I had carried this house for years. Keep the moving receipts too, she reminded me. They strengthen your case. I promised her I would. Hanging up, I looked around the half-empty living room, the walls echoing with the absence of the furniture I had chosen. This wasn't a loss. This was a reclamation. My parents thought they had stripped me of my power. They were about to learn how wrong they were. By mid-afternoon, the movers were done, the truck full of my belongings headed toward storage. I stood in the empty living room, the air heavier without the warmth of the pieces I had chosen. The silence was pierced by a sharp knock at the door. When I opened it, my sister Lauren stood there, her suitcase at her feet, eyes narrowing as she stepped forward. She had arrived earlier than I expected, ready to claim what she thought was hers. But she wasn't walking into the home she imagined. She was walking into a battlefield, and I was no longer the quiet daughter who bowed her head. I was ready to fight. Lauren brushed past me without waiting for an invitation, her suitcase wheels scraping against the hardwood floor. Her heels clicked through the hallway as she scanned the barren living room, her expression souring with every empty corner. "Where's everything?" she demanded, her voice sharp and entitled. The anger in her tone made me clench my fists, but I stayed calm, leaning against the doorframe with arms crossed. "I took what belonged to me," I replied evenly. Her face flushed red, disbelief flickering before rage settled in. "Yours?" she snapped. "Mom and Dad told me this house is mine now. You don't get to strip it bare." She spun in a circle, taking in the vacant space, her breathing quickening as though she'd been cheated out of some prize. I held my ground. That sofa, the television, the washer, the chairs, every last thing I took was paid for with my money, my overtime, my sacrifices. "You didn't contribute a dime, Lauren, not one," she scoffed, her laugh cold and bitter. "So what? You think throwing money around makes you entitled to everything?" She shot back. This is my home now, Clara. You're out. The words dripped with triumph, as if she truly believed she had already won. My jaw tightened, but my voice stayed firm. You haven't been here in years. I kept this place standing while you lived your life in California. Too busy to even call more than twice a year. I carried this house. You walked away. Her smirk widened, cruel and mocking. Oh please, she sneered. You stayed here out of pity, pretending to be the good daughter. Mom and Dad chose me for a reason. Her words stabbed like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last, but I refused to show the pain. I stepped closer, my voice lowering to steel. They chose wrong. You don't know half of what I've done to keep this family together. She stormed through the kitchen, her voice rising as she noticed the tagged spaces where furniture had been removed. The chairs, the curtains. You took everything. Her outrage echoed through the hollow house. I met her fury with calm resolve. Only what I bought. You want a home? Furnish it yourself. Lauren's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. Her face twisted in fury. You're unbelievable, she spat, her voice trembling. I'm calling Mom and Dad. They'll deal with you. I shrugged, leaning casually against the wall. Go ahead, they're not here. Her face froze in confusion. What do you mean? She asked, but I didn't elaborate. I watched as she dialed, her fingers fumbling, her voice rising as she paced the kitchen. Mom, she gutted the place. It's empty. I stayed silent, arms folded, letting her rant into the phone. When she hung up, she glared at me with venom. They're coming back tonight from Montpelier, she said, her tone shaking with rage. You're done, Clara. I simply pointed toward the door. You know where the exit island. Her suitcase thudded as she yanked it upright, muttering curses under her breath. The door slammed so hard behind her that the frame rattled. For a moment, I stood alone in the silence, my heart pounding against my ribs. But beneath the adrenaline, I felt a quiet certainty. She thought she could walk in and claim everything. She had no idea what was coming. That evening, I sat in Rachel's apartment downtown, my belongings safely stored in a nearby unit. The phone buzzed relentlessly, with my mother's name flashing across the screen. I ignored it at first, knowing exactly what the voicemail would say. When I finally listened, her voice was sharp and frantic. Clara, what have you done? There's a stranger in our house. My father's voice cut in, heavy with disbelief. Some man claims he owns it now. Explain yourself. I didn't return the call. The truth was simple. Their lies had caught up with them. Rachel had moved quickly, leveraging my grandfather's will to file a legal claim that exposed everything they had hidden. The house was no longer under their control. It had been sold, quietly and legally, to a local investor who jumped at the chance to buy property in Maplewood. I hadn't orchestrated the sale myself, but by enforcing my rights, I had set the wheels in motion. The phone rang again, this time my father's number. I answered, my voice steady, though my hands trembled. Dad, I'm not coming back, I said before he could begin. You hid my grandfather's will. You tried to give my home to Lauren. His voice sputtered with a mix of anger and shock. We were protecting the family. You can't just I cut him off. Number. You were protecting her. Not me. The will was clear. This is on you. I ended the call, my chest tight but my resolve stronger than ever. A few minutes later, my mother's voice pierced through the line, shrill with accusation. Clara, you're tearing this family apart. Come fix this. My grip tightened around the phone, but my voice was cold as ice. I'm done fixing your mistakes. Talk to Rachel. Talk to the will. When I hung up, the silence that followed was heavy but freeing. Rachel looked up from her laptop, her eyes sharp with determination. They're panicking, she said. The new owner has the deed. They can't undo this. I nodded, a strange relief washing over me. The house I had once poured everything into was no longer mine. Not because I wanted to let it go, but because their betrayal had left me no other choice. They thought I would fold under pressure. They thought I would bow my head and walk away. They were wrong. The days that followed blurred into a mix of exhaustion and clarity. My phone became a vessel for their desperate voices. Messages piling one after another, each more frantic than the last. Clara, we're your family, my mother pleaded in one. You can't do this to us. In another, my father's voice cracked, strained with panic. We've lost everything. Please, come back and make this right. I listened once, then set the phone down, refusing to let their desperation coil around my heart. I wasn't the one who had broken trust. They had. The will was my shield, undeniable proof of what my grandfather wanted. Their cries were nothing more than the echoes of their own deception. I spent more time at Rachel's apartment during those weeks than in my own. Her space became a refuge, her presence a steady reminder that I wasn't losing my mind. Papers spread across her kitchen counter, files neatly stacked, legal documents highlighted in bright yellow. She moved through them with the calm precision of someone who thrived in storms. Every time my phone buzzed, she would glance at me with a quiet firmness. Don't answer. They chose their path. You're choosing yours. Her words anchored me, helping me silence the guilt that tried to creep in late at night. The house itself became a ghost in my thoughts. I drove past it once, late in the evening when the streets were quiet. The windows glowed with new light, the porch freshly painted. The investor who had bought it was already transforming it, reshaping the place I had poured my life into. I parked across the street and sat in my car, watching the house that had once been everything to me. Strangely, I didn't feel the crushing loss I expected. Instead, I felt distance, as though the house belonged to someone else now, as though it had been part of a chapter that had finally closed. My grandfather's will had given me strength, but my decision to enforce it had given me freedom. Rachel said it best one night over coffee. You've been carrying this family for too long, Clara. You poured yourself into that house because you believed it was your proof of belonging. But you belong simply because you are you. They just refused to see it. I stared into my mug, her words sinking deeper than I wanted to admit. She was right. For years I had confused sacrifice with love, believing that if I gave enough, my parents would finally acknowledge me. But now, stripped of the house, of their approval, I was beginning to understand something new. My worth wasn't tied to what I gave them. It was tied to the fact that I could stand up, draw a line, and say no more. Months later, I found myself in a new apartment downtown, sunlight streaming through wide windows that overlooked Maplewood's busy streets. The walls were bare at first, but slowly I began to fill them with pieces of myself. My sofa, the one I had fought to keep, sat proudly in the living room. The television, the rug, the lamp, all reminders not of sacrifice, but of reclamation. Each evening, I arranged the space to feel more like mine. This time, I wasn't carrying anyone else's burdens. This time, I was building a life on my terms. Work had shifted too. I had left my software job for a position at a small marketing firm, a decision that surprised even me. But the new environment was vibrant, alive with ideas and collaboration. For once, my voice was heard, my suggestions valued. I walked into each meeting no longer weighed down by the heaviness of my parents' expectations. My days became a rhythm of creativity and connection, punctuated by coffee runs to the corner cafe and evenings spent arranging my little apartment just the way I wanted it. The silence from my family was heavy at first. After weeks of unanswered calls, they stopped trying. I blocked their numbers eventually, needing the peace. At night, the quiet settled around me, strange but comforting. I learned to sit in it without guilt, to let the silence be healing instead of haunting. Through a mutual friend, I heard bits of news. Lauren had been forced to buy her own home back in California, dipping into savings she never planned to touch. My parents had moved into a small rental at the edge of town, their reputation crumbling as neighbors whispered about how they had hidden my grandfather's will. The community that once respected them now looked at them with disappointment. Their choices had carved their reality, and I no longer carried their consequences. One evening, Rachel and I sat across from each other at the cafe, steam rising from our cups. She studied me for a moment, then smiled knowingly. "You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for," she said. I smiled back, and for the first time, I felt the truth of it. The weight I had carried for years was gone. I wasn't just surviving without them, I was thriving. My life no longer revolved around a house or their approval. It revolved around me, my choices, my freedom. The hardest lesson had been setting boundaries. Cutting contact wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about protecting myself, about finally choosing peace over endless sacrifice. I had given too much for too long, trying to prove my worth to people who refused to see it. Now, I knew better. I walked through Maplewood streets one evening, the lakefront glowing in the sunset. The air was crisp, my steps light, my heart unburdened. The life I was building wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, that was enough. Seasons shifted, and with each passing month, the sharp edges of pain softened into something more bearable. Winter came first, wrapping Maplewood in snow that blanketed the streets and rooftops, silencing the world with its quiet weight. I decorated my apartment with strings of lights, a small tree in the corner, and the familiar ornaments I had carried with me. For the first time, the holiday season wasn't tied to the old house or my parents' expectations. It was mine alone, a celebration of resilience, a reminder that family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes, it's the one you choose. Rachel joined me for dinner that Christmas Eve. We cooked together, laughing as we burned the first batch of cookies, and argued about the right amount of cinnamon in mulled wine. The apartment smelled like warmth and laughter, and as we sat on the sofa I had fought so hard to keep, I realized something important. The objects around me weren't just possessions anymore. They were symbols of survival, each one carrying a piece of my fight to claim my own life. That sofa wasn't just a place to sit. It was the proof that I could stand up against anyone, even those who shared my blood. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal. Blossoms lined the streets, and I walked more often, letting the crisp air clear away lingering doubts. Work blossomed too, my ideas gaining traction at the marketing firm. I pitched campaigns that clients embraced, and my team began to rely on me not just as a contributor but as a leader. For once, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't overlooked or dismissed. I was finally seen. And it wasn't because I sacrificed endlessly, it was because I believed in myself enough to speak and act with confidence. There were nights when memories tugged at me. I would sit by the window, staring out at the city lights, and think of my grandfather. His voice still echoed in my heart, telling me this house will always be yours. At first, that memory hurt, a reminder of what had been stolen. But as time passed, I began to understand his words differently. He hadn't meant the house itself, not the walls or the roof. He had meant the sense of belonging, the legacy of strength and independence he saw in me even when I couldn't see it in myself. That was the gift he left me, and no betrayal could erase it. Summer brought long days and golden sunsets over the lake. I started taking weekend trips, exploring trails I had never bothered to hike before, tasting foods from little roadside diners, and learning what it felt like to live without permission. I met new people too, coworkers who invited me to barbecues, neighbors who stopped for chats at the mailbox. Slowly, a community began to form around me, not forced by blood but chosen by kindness. I discovered joy in small things. Morning coffee on the balcony, music drifting through open windows, the freedom of not waiting for anyone's approval. Meanwhile, whispers of my family's struggles reached me from time to time. My parents had fallen into deeper financial strain, their reputation shattered after neighbors discovered they had hidden my grandfather's will. The community that once admired them now looked at them with disappointment, some even with pity. Lauren, I heard, had settled into her new house in California, but she carried the bitterness of spending her own money rather than inheriting what she thought was guaranteed. None of it gave me joy, but neither did it weigh me down. Their choices had led them here. I was no longer responsible for carrying the consequences. Rachel remained my anchor, her friendship a constant reminder that loyalty and love exist outside the confines of family. One evening, over dinner, she looked at me with a grin. "Do you realize how far you've come?" she asked. 6 months ago, you thought losing that house was the end of you. Now look at you, you're stronger, freer, more alive than I've ever seen you. I laughed, though her words stung with truth. She was right. I had once tied my entire worth to the walls of a house, to the approval of parents who never truly saw me. Now I knew better. My worth came from within, from the choices I made to honor myself. Autumn rolled in with crisp air and fiery leaves. I found myself walking through Maplewood with a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The streets that once reminded me of loss, now reminded me of growth. I passed the old family home one evening, its porch lights glowing softly. The new owner had planted flowers by the walkway, a fresh coat of paint brightening the shutters. For a moment, I stopped, letting the sight wash over me. I didn't feel bitterness. I didn't feel robbed. I felt closure. That chapter belonged to the past, and I was finally living in the present. I turned away, heading back toward my apartment where my life waited, warm and inviting. My journey wasn't perfect. There were scars, memories that still ached on lonely nights. But the life I was building was mine. And for the first time, that was more than enough. The first anniversary of leaving the house came quietly, almost without me realizing. One evening, I sat by the window of my apartment, sipping tea, the city lights glittering beyond the glass. A year ago, I had been packing boxes with shaking hands, terrified of what would come next. Now I sat surrounded by the home I had built on my own terms. And the fear that once consumed me was nothing more than a shadow in the distance. The old wounds had not disappeared completely. Sometimes I dreamed of that night at the dinner table, my mother's fork slamming against wood, the ultimatum ringing in my ears. Sometimes I woke with the memory of my father's silence, the betrayal heavy in my chest. But when those memories surfaced, I reminded myself of what followed. The courage to stand up, the strength to claim what was mine, the resolve to walk away from the cycle of sacrifice that had chained me for years. Pain might have been the beginning, but it was never the ending. On weekends, I often walked along the lakefront, watching families stroll with children, couples holding hands, joggers weaving through the crowd. I no longer envied them. Instead, I felt a quiet belonging, not to a family that had turned its back, but to the larger rhythm of life unfolding around me. I realized belonging isn't always about where you come from. Sometimes, it's about where you choose to stand. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned more about my parents. Their lives had shrunk into the small rental house on the edge of town. They kept to themselves, avoiding neighbors who whispered about the will they had hidden. Once, I might have pitied them, might have rushed to ease their burdens as I always had. But now, I let the news settle without action. Compassion did not require sacrifice. I could wish them well from a distance without carrying their weight on my shoulders. As for Lauren, she remained in California, her life polished on the surface but riddled with quiet discontent. I heard she had bought her house reluctantly, bitterness staining her words whenever the topic of inheritance arose. She had expected to inherit everything without effort. Instead, she had been forced to pay her own way. I didn't revel in her struggles, but neither did I mourn them. Life had finally given her what I had carried for years: the responsibility of standing on her own. Rachel's friendship continued to shape the new life I was building. She often reminded me of how far I had come, her laughter filling my apartment on nights when we shared dinner or wine. "You've learned to choose yourself," she said one evening, her tone both proud and affectionate, "and that, Clara, is the hardest and most important lesson anyone can learn." I smiled at her words, feeling them settle deep inside me. She was right. Choosing myself had been the battle of a lifetime, and I had won. Work flourished as well. I had been promoted to lead a small team at the firm, my ideas guiding campaigns that clients praised. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving, carving a place where my voice mattered. The pride I felt no longer came from desperate sacrifices for others. It came from building something of my own, from standing tall without apology. One evening, as autumn deepened and the leaves turned shades of fire, I walked past the old house once more. The porch light glowed warmly, the flower beds carefully tended, a family laughing inside where shadows danced on the curtains. I paused only for a moment, then smiled softly. That house no longer belonged to me, not legally, not emotionally. But the legacy my grandfather had left me, the promise that I would always belong, lived on in me. It wasn't tied to the bricks or the beams. It was tied to the strength I had discovered, the independence I had claimed, and the peace I now carried. I turned away from the house, my steps steady as I walked back toward my apartment. The chapter was closed, the story complete. I no longer defined myself by what was lost, but by what I had gained: boundaries, freedom, peace, a life of my own making. And as the evening air wrapped around me, I whispered a quiet promise to myself: I will never again diminish who I am just to be loved. I will never again sacrifice myself to hold together something meant to break. I choose me. Always. The lights of the city glowed ahead, welcoming me home, not to the past, not to the pain, but to the life I had finally claimed as mine.